Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the public for joining us in person and online, as well as our commissioners. This is the second workshop meeting that we are having that brings in community and has them meet with commissioners to talk through final proposed language for the community equity priorities. Many of you joined us yesterday. And yesterday we did a deeper dive into the data on the demographics, who we spoke to, who did we hear from. We do have more community equity priorities to address today. So we're going to show you the slides, but we're not going to dive into the demographics. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with Maya or with myself or with Lorenzo. And we're going to do the same for community engagement. We want to show you the visual of what we did, but we want to be able to reserve time so that there's more interaction with folks both online as well as in person to work through the community equity priorities. I also just want to note this is our first live event. So we are live on Instagram and we have about 300 followers. So for anyone who's following online, thank you so much. Invite a friend, share the link. We're going to do a few things today. So I just want to open up a little bit about the community equity priorities that we're going to review. For all the commissioners and for everyone online, you should have received a worksheet that we're going to work through together. And that's really what your small group conversations will be about, as well as a series of community equity priority profiles, which is really a snapshot of available data. And as a reminder from yesterday, in this process, we learned that there is a lot of data that's not publicly available, and we wanted to be mindful and intentional with our decision-making process and ensure that we are reviewing data that is also reviewed by the public. It is truly a snapshot. So if there are questions that come up for you during this process, please write them down, and also know that those questions most likely came up for us as well. We're going to spend as much time as we can in the workshopping session so that we can get your line edits, and the final proposed language that you see on your sheet comes from over 4,212 responses, where we integrated over, or we did our best to integrate over 1,000 qualitative responses. And we also have some added language. And then we're going to offer, we have some added priorities that was a request from the public. And then we're going to offer a quick share out. So these are just 1 to 2 things that come up in your group, because we want to make sure to end on time and remain in integrity with everyone's calendar. And then we're going to close out. The original vision was that we would be able to vote on the language, but we actually got a lot of really great feedback. And so we want to honor that process. So we will not be voting today. We will be getting final language. And then we're going to close it out, and then commissioners will vote. And we are going to go back as a core staff, as a commission staff, to explore how do we make sure to do that and remain in integrity with what we're asking all of city government to do. So we'll be coming back to the public and back to commissioners on what that proposed process looks like. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so I would just say on the last note, with respect to the opening remarks, is that the community equity priorities that we're addressing today are the fundamental value is that our government ensures the condition of thriving for every person. That is particularly difficult when we have folks who told us across New York City they cannot afford food. We are talking about quality of food, and they're saying food, like, give me anything. And that was particularly heartbreaking for all the obvious reasons, right? So folks are saying, we can't afford food, we can't afford our rent. And also young people are saying that. It is sitting on the shoulders of our youngest New Yorkers. And so we're going to talk today about the cost of living, the impact of mental health, the impact of police violence, and what are ways in which the city can do better to move people from a place of struggling, which is where our folks are, to a place of thriving. Where do they want to be? What's the dream for them, for their children, regardless of your immigration status, regardless of your race, ethnicity, your gender, your age, or any other part of your identity. So I say that to say, when we go into these conversations, we will likely have emotions that come up for us because these are our communities and these are our lives. And we also all come to the table with lived experience. And I would encourage you to use that to ensure that what comes out in the final language is both authentic, sits with integrity, with community, and really gives direction to community agencies on the types of structural change that we need. So our youngest New Yorkers and their families are not asking for food or a place to live or a quality education. That should be a given in New York City for all. So I'm going to pass it over to Lorenzo to introduce our community agreements. And then we'll go to Maya, our Director of Research and Policy. And my apologies, my name is Linda. I should have started with that. Linda Tajani, I'm the chair in ED. We do want to do a round of intros, but maybe we can do that after we do community agreements.
Hi, thank you, Linda. So welcome, everyone. My name's Lorenzo Van Ness. I'm the Director of Community Organizing and Engagement here at CORE, and my pronouns are they and them, or ella in Spanish. I just want to guide us through some community agreements so we can all, kind of set the pace of today's conversation and come from the same place, right? So in terms of community agreements, these are 5 that we usually offer, but we can also add more if people have others that they desire. But so the first one is just making I statements. So just speaking from your own experience, trying not to make generalizations about like groups or, people. The next one we have is take space, make space, which is, if you're someone who speaks a lot in spaces, making space for other people to speak. And then if you're someone who is often quiet or not sure if you should be sharing, we want to hear your voice, right? We want to hear from you. Then we have ouch and oops, which is just to acknowledge the gap between sometimes people's intention and the impact they have when they speak. So just making sure that if something doesn't land right with you or is hurtful, you say ouch, and the person who said it says oops to really acknowledge the harm that they've caused, right? And then we can move from there to decide whether we want to discuss it now or at a later point, and then number 4, we do not have to agree. Obviously 8 million New Yorkers, we're not going to agree on many things, right? But we can find the places where our values and our perspectives intersect to really make the change that we want for the city. And then lastly, just one mic. So listening to each other and signaling if you have a question or if you want to speak. I'm also monitoring the chat. If there's any questions in there, I'll try to raise them. So yeah, just making sure that we're respecting each other in that way. What other community agreements might people need to feel comfortable or safe in the space? All right. If not, then if you're good with these, you can give me a thumbs up. Yeah, sweet. I see some thumbs. Excellent. All right. So we shall move on to the next piece. I guess, do you want to do introductions? So yeah, people can say their names, their pronouns, and who assigned them. Who appointed them to the commission.
Hi, thank you again, Linda, for cheering for everything. I'm Pesach Osina. I am appointed by New York City Council Speaker Adrian Adams.
Imam Ahmed Ali Yuzir, Mayor's appointee, he, him.
Almirka Santiago, she, her, ella, mayoral appointee.
Good afternoon, Wendy Starr, she, her, hers, mayoral appointee.
Pamor, comptroller appointee, pronouns she, ella.
Good afternoon. Torian Easterling, mayoral appointee. I use the he series.
Good afternoon, Francesca Perone, appointed by Speaker Adams, she, her, hers.
right, so moving to the next, oh, you wanted to add something?
Sorry, Grace, can we also have you introduce yourself, and Drew, if you're on the line as well?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Pyen. I was appointed by the mayor's office, and I'm she, hers.
Hi, everyone. Adam Abba, Commissioner Representative Bronx. Oh, I'm appointed by Adrian Adams, Speaker.
All right, so just a really, really brief recap because we went through this yesterday, and also soon you will see our share out that is going to be posted on our YouTube channel, so you can catch even more in-depth information about the data. But just to refresh people's memories, we got over 4,000 surveys or responses to our feedback form, and as you can see in this map, we did events all over the city, particularly targeting the neighborhoods designated by the Tree Network. And we'll talk more about that later. And yeah, I just wanted to offer a little visual of all the different community conversations that we hosted or that were hosted by community partners that we're extremely thankful of. So yeah, I'll leave that there and pass it on to Maya.
Great. So we also went through yesterday demographics. We, as we said, spoke to over 4,000 New Yorkers. When it comes to demographics, highly populated with people of color across New York City, and targeted the Tree Network. So 58.3% of respondents came from Tree neighborhoods, which are really just a measure when we think about identifying marginalized communities as mandated in the charter, really the city's measure of how we gear to that population. You'll notice through the screen, which we're just going to slide by, again, as Lorenzo mentioned, this information will be available to you all online. But highly respondents came from the Bronx, 23.5%, and you'll notice there, followed by Brooklyn and Manhattan and Queens, respectively. And again, to the Tree neighborhoods target, you'll notice the 58.3% respondents from those neighborhoods. And just really one thing that came up in the demographics is that a lot of people chose not to share their personal information. That question we did offer to respondents as voluntary. So you'll notice that through the slides as well, people just chose to omit their personal information. And again here, just a quick recap, when it comes to age, we offered the public feedback response to individuals as young as 11 years old. We did have one respondent who was 10 years old, which we are so grateful to have, excited to get their input, really just understanding that young people have a lot to offer in this space as well. And to the right, you'll notice the various gender and gender identities that people have shared with us who took the feedback response. And these two here, just people identifying the highest level of education, as well as if they're experiencing disabilities or other chronic conditions, which we know is very persistent in communities of color. All right, so today's session, again, as Linda mentioned, is centered around our fundamental value of our government ensures the condition of thriving for every person. These set of priorities really challenge us to think about how communities harmed by racism will be able to advance from a state of survival and into a state of thriving, thinking about how we can provide communities the opportunity to really get access to life's basic needs, whether that be housing, mental health, other healthcare services, as well as equitable education and resources. So when we launched the draft community equity priorities, there were 6 draft community equity priorities within this fundamental value. And as we go through it, what we'll do is just share the number of respondents who have agreed as well as disagreed. We also mentioned that while the community engagement campaign was happening, we were looking into publicly available data to really speak to the existing inequities that are presented in the draft community equity priorities. We've talked to many different agencies about getting access to certain publicly available data, pointing us to really what it is that they're experiencing when it comes to their government operations and how that is reflective upon what communities are asking within the draft community equity priorities. So once I go through each one, I'll be sure to just share what we've heard from communities, but I'll also direct you to what we're naming as just a snapshot, right? We name them as data profiles, but they're just a snapshot of what we felt was relevant compared to what communities have shared with us about their experience. And with most of it, or at least some of it, I should say, there is not a lot of publicly available data that will tell a full story about this. But core, we have hopes to, as we move through this process, get access to that, be able to really understand the root causes to some of these existing inequities. Okay.
We're taking a brief second to introduce another commissioners joining us. And then we'll dive right back into the responses. Welcome.
Apologies for being late. Cristobal Gutierrez, he, him, and I'm a commissioner. Oh, I was appointed by the Speakers Council.
All right, so the sixth draft community equity priority reads to ensure and appropriately fund prevention and provide legal and financial support for families facing eviction, lease theft, and deed theft. So communities have told us that it's not just about funding prevention and intervention, right? They're worried about just getting access to housing in general, preventative measures that will allow for rent stabilized apartments, will allow for them to not really be experiencing risk of being removed and being unhoused and experiencing homelessness. We've also heard from communities saying that communities of color are more prone to homeowners, deed thefts, as well as lease theft. So just speaking to that, when we think about the publicly available data, what you'll notice, actually, I'm sorry, I'll just briefly say that within this draft community equity priority, there were 83.9% of respondents that agreed, compared to 5.6% who disagreed. And we mentioned this yesterday, a number of reasons why people would disagree. A lot of the community equity priorities present nuanced conversations. They offer more than one proposal. A lot of people asking questions about implementation and how would their daily lives be impacted if government operations shifted in certain ways. So just want to, lift that up, but also sharing that over 80% of people have agreed with this draft community equity priority. When it comes to the publicly available data, reports have shown that the median rent price in 2023 was $3,500. We all are not privy, we all are very aware of high rent prices that many New Yorkers are experiencing. When it comes to homeowners deed theft, publicly available data shows that crime is most common in Brooklyn. Actually, 45% of deed theft complaints were recorded from Brooklyn. And then thinking about evictions, right? Communities of color really experiencing that more than white residents across New York City. Evictions, there is a rent to council program which offers free legal service representation for people facing eviction. But as you can imagine, there's limitations for that. There's limitations to the program, which is highly under-resourced. When we think about the high demand for New Yorkers across needing legal representation, and that representation being critical for people being supported. It was shown in several reports that this program is budgeted at $166 million. For fiscal year 2025, but thinking about the high demand of people is approximately 186,000 that would need these supports, recognizing the limitations to attorneys even being able to hold this work. So the proposed new language, after we've heard from communities, again, lifting up that they're like, hey, I'm just concerned about getting access to housing. I'm concerned about keeping the space to live in my apartment and stability for that. The proposed new language reads to increase housing access and security for New Yorkers facing homelessness, eviction, and deed theft. Community equity priority number 7, to remove all government issue fees for services where possible and convert remaining fees and fines to an income-based sliding scale. So communities have told us they are experiencing just being able to not like being charged for fines and fees, but then also the affordability, right? So not only being charged, but then penalized for the inability to pay specific fines and fees. And, you know, that's a real experience that we've heard countless times when we think about when communities have proposed this and we've asked them their feedback, 76.9% of respondents agreed with this community equity priority compared to 7.5% who disagreed. And we have really looked at all 16 priorities. This was one of the priorities that offered a lot of conversation. It was one of the priorities out of the 16 that under 80% of respondents agreed to, and this is for a number of reasons. People have asked us, what do you mean by government issue fees for services? People have questioned the idea of what is a shift of an income-based sliding scale look like? How would they be impacted as a taxpayer, thinking about fines and fees really being a large amount of revenue source for New York City? So people are concerned again about the implementation of this, how it impacts the city budget. When we looked at publicly available data, we learned that despite the number of fines and fees proposed, whether that be from violations for parking, tickets, and just criminal summonses, fines and fees yield $1 billion towards New York City revenue. And when you think about that compared to how much communities of color are actually being like poverty penalized for some of this, just something to really think about when we think about how specific government operations can be shifted to adhere to this struggle for communities of color. You'll notice also on the profile, just criminal justice fees and fines that communities of color are more prone to, and in comparison to New York City white residents. Draft community equity priority number 8 reads to institute and appropriately fund trauma-informed community safety practices and responses to mental health calls that lessens reliance on law enforcement. So we've heard from communities the high level of mental health crisis that New York City, that New Yorkers are experiencing, and really just in a response to that, how are they being supported, right? We know many different programs that are available that one can argue are not funded as much, are not being used to really move our city away from relying on NYPD to respond to people who are undergoing mental health crises. Communities have said that. The publicly available data has shown that. When we think about, you know, NYPD receiving limited training for several calls that when they do arrive, some of them result in physical, emotional, and mental health harm to the person in crisis. And the graph there just shows the disparities with that, right? The number of people of color who are victims of NYPD using force as a response to mental health crises. Thinking about the programs that are available to adhere to this, about, you know, Be Heard, that does exist, but also our city, despite many of these programs, are still heavily relying on NYPD to be a support for people in crisis. In the proposed new language, following both the publicly available data and what we've heard from communities, is to use and expand programs trained to respond to mental health crises that do not rely on police. And again, this was one of the community equity priorities that over 80% agreed, 82.8% respondents agreed with this priority, and 5.7% disagreed. Draft community equity priority number 9, to increase and appropriately fund school districts that are suffering from racial and class segregation to provide students and families with social, emotional, health, educational, nutritional, and social services before, during, and out of school time hours year-round. 86.1% respondents agreed to this community equity priority versus 5.6% who disagreed. And again, communities have just told us the schools that are in their particular neighborhoods are not as funded and are not as well resourced as those schools are in predominantly wealthier neighborhoods. This adheres to just structural factors, including budgets and admission screens, limiting growth and equitable academic achievement, as well as equitable access to education for students of color who do make up majority of New York City public schools. The data there just shows, 32% of New York City's population identifies white, but only 16% of public school students are white, while 94% of students attend schools that are 50% or more populated with students of color. And we're just, showing here the student proficiency levels that are that students are being impacted by. Students of color are not as proficient when it comes to state math and English language arts exams. And this can just be contributed to one, what we mentioned, academic screening and enrollment, as well as the formulas and budgets that are provided for education systems within communities of color. The proposed new language for number 9 reads to expand and support efforts to integrate schools racially and economically, ensure all students and families get academic, mental, and physical health support. Right. Number 10 reads to increase and appropriately fund the number of organizations working with New York City government to provide health, mental health, and substance use programs that understand the lived experience of community members most harmed by racism. So again, when we spoke to communities within the public feedback response, 86.3% of respondents agreed with this community equity priority compared to 5.5% who disagreed. Communities, again, have shared with us that just social health and mental health programs are lacking in specific supports. Thinking about the amount of care and both healthcare and substance use care for communities of color, recognizing that they experience these social health and mental health issues more than New York City white residents. The data shows that white people have a longer life expectancy. They have more access to health insurance and access to mental health treatments more than people of color. And communities want to be able to have access to care equitably and access for them to really be able to thrive. The new proposed language reads to expand health, mental health, substance use, and disability services to meet the needs of New Yorkers harmed by racism and social injustice. Number 11 is also one of the draft community equity priorities where the agreements came up under 80%. It reads to remove all tuition and associated fees for New York City residents attending all CUNY junior and senior colleges. People have expressed the hindrance of accessing and affording higher education, recognizing that access to CUNY really supports people in social mobility. It has ever since it's existed. They want to be able to finish school. They want to be able to have access to better jobs, better pay, which we know education gives folks an opportunity to do. But they are experiencing other issues, right? Communities of students of color make up the largest population of CUNY students. 85% of CUNY students are people of color, yet only 64% of CUNY graduates are people of color. So when we looked at the available public data, more than half of CUNY's junior colleges, college students drop out before their third year. And the graph to your left really just shows what they're experiencing while trying to finish college. 34% of them having difficulty with rent or mortgage increases, 20% not having health coverage or unsure of their health because of lack of coverage, and then really having to balance education as well as working 35 hours or more per week, which 31% of students have shared. And this data comes from the CUNY Student Experience Survey, where students were offered the opportunity to just share what it is that they're experiencing as students. And the new proposed language reads to remove costs and barriers to CUNY enrollment and retention. And I don't think I mentioned this, but 78.7% of respondents agreed, while 8.5% disagreed with this community equity priority. All right. So again, we mentioned six we provided within the public feedback response, asking people what they've agreed or disagreed with. And within the public feedback response, we offered an open text box, which really asks people if there's anything that they would add, remove, or change that is not presented in the draft 16 community equity priorities. And people were very open to sharing with us what we've missed, what it is that they're experiencing that they feel is more of a priority that should be included. So this new priority, which adheres to the cost of living, reads to increase access to and lower the cost of quality food, transportation, and housing. And again, people have, when we look through all 16 of them, we did not have a particular community equity priority that talks about food. We mentioned at the top, people are like, it's not, just about food. It's not just about quality food. We need food, right? We need to close the gaps within homelessness. We need to make sure that housing is available and that they're able to sustain it. And people also talked about the cost of transportation, the access to transportation within specific neighborhoods. So this is a new priority that was offered by communities that we would also want to vote on. Right.
Okay, thank you so much, Maya. I know it sounds like we flew through that, and so just want to remind you that the language for the proposed as well as the draft is on your worksheet. And so you have an opportunity to go dive in. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Lorenzo to talk about our workshop activity, but just want to offer to folks that we are now in the moment where it's time for you to give us your feedback. Everything and anything should be captured on the worksheet that's in front of you. What we heard yesterday was a mixture of we should replace this word, we should add in these words, but we also heard new strategies come up as well as language for potential indicators that we would propose to the city as a way to measure change. So just keep in mind that this is a everything matters conversation. If you feel like you need to doodle it first or write it on the side first, please make sure that you also get to say it in your group. Everyone online, please keep in mind that everything that we're saying here for the in-person conversation matters as well as for our Zoom breakout rooms. So we look forward to hearing, and we'll also be giving you all the opportunity to share out as well. Lorenzo, can you walk us through the sheet?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so we are offering, again, similar to what we did yesterday, we're offering just criteria for both commissioners and community to really think about the proposed final language, right? So I'd like to get volunteers maybe to read out these different criteria. So number one, we have structural change. Can someone read out for me the question around structural change?
Structural change, does the new priority language require to enact change in how they operate?
Perfect, thank you. And then number two, around racial equity, you should keep this in mind.
So on racial equity, does the new priority advance the vision of a city where race is not determinative of outcomes?
Thank you. And if anyone online also wants to unmute and read out one of these questions, feel free to. Number three, we have equitable outcome. Any other volunteers for number three?
Sure, I'll take that one. Does the new priority tell us how the well-being of communities harmed by racism and social injustice could improve?
Thank you. And then last but not least, community power. If there are no other volunteers, I'll just jump in. Why not? So community power, does the proposed priority need agencies to seek increased input from community members? Hopefully the answer is yes. All right, so moving to the next slide, these are all questions that you should just keep in mind when you're reviewing the proposed language, the new proposed language. And so what we're going to do is we're going to split up into groups where both commissioners and community members are going to review and assess the new language that's proposed. Then we're going to give you about 35 minutes to really think about these 4 questions for each priority and see if they actually meet those criteria, right? And remember that the priority shouldn't necessarily be about what strategy we're using, but you can also add strategies that we can use later when we're giving agencies feedback. So you may want to suggest, you might want to be like, this is how you'll measure it. And then it's like, okay, well, we will do that, but that's the next step. That's not the priority. All right. So yeah, so please here in the room, if we could split up into 2 separate groups and rearrange chairs. And then we'll be doing a breakout room on Zoom. So please do participate. And we have 2 commissioners on Zoom that can facilitate. What questions? Does anyone have any questions? I see a hand raised on Zoom. Angela?
Hi. Yes, hi. Are we only thank you for allowing me to ask a question. Are we looking at the proposed language as is, or is this not, or is this an opportunity to suggest changes in the draft language itself?
Yes, there is an opportunity to suggest more changes to the draft language. So yeah, if there's anything that's blaringly that you're like, oh, this is missing, definitely suggest it, and we'll take into consideration in the final language. But yeah. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns, hopes, dreams? Okay. All right. So let's break out into groups and let's see. Right now it is 4:47, so about 35 minutes. Oh, that's so much time. Like 5:15 or 5:20 maybe? Yeah. All right. Break.
Is everyone?
Hey folks, not to interrupt you, but just to let you know, we're about 20 minutes in, so you should be about halfway through. 15 more minutes. Hey, folks, just to let you know, I'm going to add on 5 minutes, so you have 5 minutes left. Right. So there's 1 minute left. Be sure to ask your your group which commissioner is going to report back. And All right, folks. Folks are coming back from the breakout room, so if we can move back into our Thank you, everyone. There was so many good conversations happening. Now you're good. All right. So as we're shifting back into our seating arrangements here in the room, thank you everyone for having such great conversations. So we're going to have sorry, have a commissioner from each group. So we had 4 groups. Just talk about 1 to 2 things that were discussed in your group. So you don't have to necessarily go through all of the priorities. We're gonna collect your notes, so we will have that all. But if you wanna have one person from each group mention a few things, so take like 1 to 2 minutes. Who wants to go first?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Somebody online want to go first? Yeah. Oh, okay.
Sure.
So for number 6, to ensure increase housing access and security for New Yorkers facing homelessness, eviction, and deed theft. Originally, we thought that was one that was too much happening there, but we definitely want to define increased housing access, because if we say that, then they're gonna start building mansions and exclude us who are low income communities. So we wanted to put in the language, the percentage, which is integrate 20% of housing access and security for New Yorkers facing homelessness, eviction, and deed theft. And we also thought about separating the conversation from deed theft to homelessness, but we eventually went by, let's just leave it, because then we're separating priorities and then we can address each unit, city unit separately. So that was for number 6. I'll pass it on so someone else can take number 7 since we don't have a lot of time.
And so we discussed about removing the government issued fees for services where possible. And what we discussed that there should be a way that if someone have low income, then we should deal with them individually on their situation. Like if someone who doesn't have a fee to pay at a subway station, he should not be treated as someone who have money and he just jumped up for fun or something. So there should be a way to find out, maybe by seeing their financial status, if they have a job, or so there we should make it more equitable for anyone who doesn't have income resources or proper, you can say, like access to a metro card to cover their costs. So we have to make it more easy for everyone depending on their situation.
Right. I just wanted to add one other comment that came up in the group, which I think is really helpful to think about many of the priorities, which was that the word affordable does not hold any weight anymore in New York City. And so when we're saying affordable housing or affordable transportation, or even just like affordable food, right? Because we address the cost of food, that because the word affordable doesn't hold any weight, we have to be so much more explicit. So we talked about, instead of rent burden is people who pay 30% or more, which is a majority of the city. What if we actually were prescriptive and said 20% actually should be the max? Not to say that that's what we're definitely proposing, but just to note that the language that communities have long used in the fight for social justice and equity has been used so much that it doesn't have the same meaning. And we need to make sure that the meaning of the people hold in the new version of the priorities.
Can I add something? That in the priority. Oh, sorry, thank you. Families facing eviction, families facing homelessness and deed theft, those all might require different interventions. And kind of how do we fit language that would put all of those people under an umbrella theory, which is that people deserve access and dignity to safe and affordable housing, and if we defined affordability, but that was something that we really sat with for quite a bit of time. That is, policy prescriptions for each of those populations should vary and do vary, and that was something difficult for us to parse out during our discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of different, we could think of probably like 20 strategies for each one of these, right? To do different things. And we can propose those all and see which ones stick for sure. All right. So another group, would you like to, yeah, there you go.
Sure.
Hello. So our group spent a bit of time focusing on definitions of words and making sure that we know exactly what we're talking about, as other commissioners mentioned. So what does appropriately fund mean? Is there a metric for that? Is there a percentage? In addition to ensuring that when we're increasing housing, as other commissioners had mentioned, what does that mean? How do we quantify that? And then what would an indicator look like as the counterpart when we start creating those? And then I think we left off at the proposal number 8. So use and expand programs trained to respond to mental health crises that do not rely on police. The group discussed that the mental health program should be appropriately funded, and we were exploring potential ideas to allocate funding from the NYPD to ensure that some of that funding goes towards mental health crises by organizations and groups that are not directly affiliated. So being able to kind of rework the system that we're in.
Oh yeah, so yeah, we had 2 groups online. Grace, would you like to report back? Or I'm not sure, Drew, if you're still here?
Yeah, I'll report back. So first want to thank Angela, Denise, and Gilbert for joining the breakout groups and just being with us. Overarching necessarily for a lot of the priorities that we discussed was really just we focused on tweaking the language, but in addition, necessarily looking at a class that we don't typically get a chance to, which is young people, and really just putting in place necessarily some of the services that they need, especially for priority number 1 or priority number 6, adding child protective services to that category too, as well as to that priority. In addition, priority number 7, removing language and adding eliminate or reduce the impact, so that this way it has more of an emphasis on exactly what we want to try to get towards. The same thing as we're talking about responses for mental health within priority number 8, which should be the responses to mental health crisis and child protective services. Priority number 9, really just necessarily removing the word integrate and changing what that language looks like so that we ensure that families and children have opportunities and resources. And then for priority number 10, adding more effective and appropriate, sorry, just looking back at my notes, adding more effective and appropriate language that will necessarily address, sorry, confused my notes for that last part. When we talk about mental health services, instead of saying expand, I'm adding a language that is more effective and appropriate. Now, again, overarching theme of everything that we discussed was really just focusing more on that population for youth that are under 25, but also necessarily just strengthening what we have in place for our families, and making sure that that language for all these priorities are more defined or well defined.
Thank you.
Sorry, one quick question, Drew, for your group. Is one of the recommendations to say that social workers and or responders to mental health crisis calls should also be responders in CPS related calls? No.
If I may?
Like,
No.
no. Go for it, Angela.
Please, Angela.
So what we were discussing was focusing not so much on expanding programs, but using and expanding, and this is for number 8, using and expanding responses or appropriate individualized responses or trauma-informed responses to mental health crises or child safety or child welfare concerns that do not rely on police or child protective services intervention. So it was more to kind of pull in some of that language from the draft, and also include child protective services responses, which are analogous in many respects to law enforcement or police responses. And so we wanted to, expand not only the concept, not so much in terms of, oh, social workers should respond instead of police or whatever, but that whoever responds should be responding in a way that's not punitive, but in a way that's supportive, trauma informed, etc. So the focus would be on the responses and the nature and quality of the responses as opposed to programs or agencies.
I can report out on the other online group. We had a really fantastic discussion about each priority. I'll try to just say some arching themes that came up. One was an interesting thought about the 4 New Yorkers phrase, that there's some folks who may be here, asylum seekers, others in our community that may not feel that that covers them as being a New Yorker. So, there were a few different options. I'm sure there's more, maybe families and individuals that reside in New York City, something along those lines. There was a thought about also making sure in our discussion of number 6 that we were talking also about removing barriers and discrimination against people who, are able to provide for themselves with respect to rent or other different areas, and making sure that they're not discriminated as to whether using the ways that they're going to be paying for that. There was also a question in a number of them, and I've tried to note it on the worksheet, the appropriately fund language folks felt should be included back in to make sure that and sometimes sustained funding was also noted to make sure that we're being very intentional about that, how important the funding is, particularly in the mental health resource one and then others throughout. And then I think I'll end on, there was an interesting discussion that we had with respect to number 9 concerning the draft versus the proposed new, which the draft indicating to appropriately fund in school districts that are suffering from racial and class segregation, as opposed to the proposed new, which is encouraging integration. And that those are 2 different things. And so there was discussion as to wanting to, among our group discussion about wanting to stick with the draft language as opposed to the proposed new language.
Okay. Sorry, I was saying that's great. And like the feedback is really great just because in transparency, education, I mean, all of these are a lot, but we hear a lot about education, and the city has done a lot of really public work and conversation on all of the things that we need to do to ensure quality education, and specifically that Brown versus Board still has not truly been met. And we have a lot of work to go through. That's really, so thank you so much for the feedback. Was this the last group? Okay. So some quick notes about next steps. So one is another note on some of the language. Appropriately fund and sustain funding has come up repeatedly. I'll say when we did the community conversations, the public really loved that language specifically. And I know we as a commission have had a lot of conversation about that language, because all of this is about shifting the city's budget, right? We need OMB to make different types of investments, but we also need all of the players at the table to essentially look at the next budget, our FY26 budget, and have city council and the mayor's team really use our priorities as a rubric for how we're spending our money and whether or not our investments are actually advancing the city towards racial equity or not. And how do we leverage all of the other roles in the budgeting process and then increase community voice in the budgeting process? So I think just to uplift, appropriately fund, and sustain is essential for all of them. And so we want to make sure that that comes across clearly. And we're going to work through how we do that, of course. So similar to yesterday, we got a lot of really great edits and a lot of really great conversation. We will have one more session that will happen Monday, November 4th. That is a morning session. So that session will start, I believe, at 10 a.m. We will also go live for that session and record and put our work up on YouTube, put all the videos up on YouTube. I just want to note for Monday session, we are going to address our last fundamental priority, which is to embrace vigilance, remedy, and reconstruction of our entire city. So here we're talking, how do we actually leverage people power to ensure and hold public officials, public servants accountable to doing what's right for the people and what we need. And these conversations have been great. They've produced strategies, they've produced outcome language. We are going to, at that meeting, come back with a plan on how we will vote and finalize the language. For everyone online and everyone watching, just to give a sense of what the next steps are. We've talked about our next steps as core, our next meeting, but we do want to ensure that you know that the city is required to put out a preliminary racial equity plan. As a city, we are expecting that plan to be published at the end of this month, so in a matter of days. You know, core is certainly looking out for it. But when we say that what you're sharing with us, your notes, your feedback, if it is not in the final language, we have the opportunity to ensure that it's in our response to the preliminary plan. So I just want to offer that up. We will be providing a comment, but we are not the only ones that can provide a comment. That preliminary plan is open to folks. And so please look out for it, share it with your community groups, share it with your organizations, and feel free to share your feedback with CORE. We're going to be talking through how we are going to reach out to all the groups that held conversations, but just want you to know that there are multiple avenues to let the city know what you and your community need. CORE is one of them, but we are not the only ones, and we're more than happy to ensure that we are able to increase your voice in this process. So there's a preliminary plan that the city would put out, and we will respond to that plan as CORE, and those are the two big pieces of work you should be looking out for. Before we close out, are there any questions or comments? Yeah. Oh, you know. Anything from folks online? Thank you, Lorenzo, for putting that up. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to close 15 minutes earlier, which is great. And have a wonderful night, everyone. We will see you Monday morning.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.